Hello, I'm Hilary Hahn, and I'm here with.
Richard Barrett.
And
You,
you are not, I don't think you're on the same continent as I am. I'm in the
no, I
States.
was I was going to say I'm speaking to you from a white-walled room in Berlin, hopefully,
That's a good
but
city.
it could be anywhere in the world, of course.
And are you in your studio area? Do you have a studio somewhere else?
No, this is where I work. It's a room which is separated off from everything else at home, but yeah, at the moment it looks rather bare because I'm in the process of reorganizing it somewhat because yeah, I just like things to be a bit different from time to time.
hmm What is your
Instead,
working, what's your
instead
working
of
process then?
the work process, well, yeah, that can vary. It really depends on what kind of thing that I'm working on. Um, so, yeah, it can be something that starts away from the studio, in fact, because I take a notebook with me wherever I go. And either in the notebook or in my laptop, I will note down some impressions of um, what I happen to be thinking about at that time. It might take the form of words or diagrams or notes even sometimes. I mean, musical notes, although it doesn't often start there because, yeah, I prefer to come to those details later on. Well, I say I prefer to. It generally happens that I come to those details later on because I was thinking about actually this aspect of the process where I'm often thinking more in terms of the structural aspects of music first, or what would generally be called the structural aspect. So, for example, if we think about the piece that I wrote for you. Now, first of all, there was a constraint on the structure of that piece, which is that it should be shorter than 4 minutes long. And so, if I have some kind of constraint like that to deal with, I suppose one of the things that often occurs to me is, what if we made this constraint even more extreme? And in this case, that consisted of thinking in terms of writing what is basically a piece in four movements, although they run continuously, and each movement is somewhere between 45 seconds and a minute long.
If you
And in
listen
fact,
really closely, you might hear the breaks between the movements, but you have to listen really closely because they're
yeah,
really short.
yeah. Well, you can normally hear that something has changed anyway,
Yes.
even though they run into each other. And in fact, these four movements. I was when I was looking at the score when it was finished, I thought this is like a kind of highly compressed version of something like Mahler's Ninth Symphony, which is an extremely long piece, of course, which has two slow movements with two fast ones in between. So it has that kind of shape, and there are certain musical aspects which are shared between all of them, and particularly this idea which comes out in the title, where there seems to me, at least, or in my mind when I was writing it, there's always a sense that some aspect of the music is a shadow of the other aspect. It may be the two instruments, or it may be something else, but that's something which is going on all the time in different ways. And so, yes, I would tend to start off thinking, and that's why I'm starting off talking about a piece like this in terms of how its overall structural relationships work. But I don't want that to give people the impression that there's something terribly abstract about the music. I mean, it's not that I mind abstract music, but I don't think it is that, because I think that as time has gone on, I've realized more and more clearly that for me, these aspects of structure in themselves are expressive factors in the music. They are as much a part of the way the music expresses itself as the things that happen from moment to moment. And of course, then you can ask, yeah, what is expressive about a form that's symmetrical in time? But then you could also say, what's expressive about C sharp major? You know, they all have every aspect of music in that way, and this is one of the most beautiful things about it. Of course, can be made to say very many different things. according to how its relationships with the other levels are concerned. And of course, that's an aspect. The idea that structure and systematic structures can be expressive in themselves is something that I suppose.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it seems to bring my attitude towards it into a certain kind of contact with the music of Alban Berg, who was also very concerned with those things, even though it sounds very different, of course.
That makes me wonder if, since you think about structure and the abstract, like where do you start? Do you start? Well, I should mention that your scores tend to have a lot of detail in them, but also the gesture is very free. I find, and I would be curious whether you start with detail or you start with the freedom of the abstract.
Well, there's no rule about that. I mean, in this case, as I said, I started off with some impression of the whole thing, and
what does that look like? Is it like is it notes? Is it a drawing? Is it maybe like a very specific like technique or something? Like what is that? Sometimes
I don't know. I think
guess it's different all the time.
I find myself experiencing and remembering music in terms of shapes. I don't know if you do that. I don't. Maybe everybody does it to some extent or other. I mean, some people are concerned with the relationship between different sounds and different colors, for example. And on the other hand, I would say I'm not really thinking about colors or shapes that could be reproduced in real life. You know, I couldn't sort of use a 3D printer to make a model of the music because it exists in a different kind of space, and it has a different kind of dimension to it. I suppose it's very difficult to describe, except that when I remember a piece of music that I've heard or that I've looked at, or that I'm working on, what comes into my mind is something like a shape and
a sensory shape. Like you can kind of almost feel it and imagine it?
It's at a stage where the senses are not separate from one another. So you can't hear it, you can't see it, you can't touch it, but you can, at the same time, you can kind of do all of those things simultaneously. Because I think if you go further back from splitting up an impression into its constituent senses, then you have something which is somehow anterior to those, and that's just one of the ways I find myself thinking about music. But anyway, coming back to this, it's a little bit like at the beginning I would see this thing from a distance, and I would gradually try and make my way towards it. And as I make my way towards it, the details become more clear. But also the shape of the whole thing might change because depending on how I can where the light falls on it, to continue that metaphor. Something that you thought was concave at first can turn out to be convex when you're closer to it, things like that. But at the same time, I'm always thinking in terms of the details. It's almost as if I'm going from both directions at once, because everything I write is also intimately connected with the instrumental resources that I'm working with, and as I try to make the music emerge from as deep as possible a contemplation of those things, which is violin and piano in this case, and so that has a very big effect on the way the music is conceived as well. Because if you're making music which doesn't depend on traditional views of musical relationships like harmony, melody, and accompaniment, and so forth, then when you're faced with the necessity to have two very dissimilar instruments behave as if they're playing the same piece at the same time, if that's the object, because it might not be, but in this case it was, then you have to find some different kind of model for how these two instruments relate to one another. So this is where the idea of the shadow comes in. So in the first part, then, you have these, a single note in the piano, which gradually spreads out into a cluster, and as it does so, the violin emerges from that pitch or from that group of pitches, and seems to emanate from the resonance of the piano sound, like a shadow which comes to light, if you like. Then in the second part, you have this very complex texture of very dense texture in the piano, with hundreds and hundreds of sounds in it, and every now and again the violin picks up on one of those and causes it to grow into something else. So it's very clear that every violin entry there is triggered off by something in this very complex piano texture, but you never know which thing it's going to be. And then in the third part, you have two voices which tend gradually to become further and further away from one another in pitch, but each voice is shared between the two instruments, so that each voice is an alternation between violin and piano, and each instrument then takes on a single voice, but it's always swapping between the two. And then that continues into the last part, but which is like the opposite of what happens in the first one, I suppose, because you start off with the quite separated registers that you have at the end of the third part, and then gradually, instead of the instruments coming together, they gradually diverge from one another, so that the piano ends up right at the bottom of its range and the violin ends up right at the top. So in a way, this gradual separation of the violin and the piano from one another is a process that goes on through all four sections, not in a straight line, but in various kinds of twists and turns. And that kind of process, again, is not really, it's not an abstraction, but it's something that emerges from looking at these two instruments and the ways in which they could be seen to relate or not to relate to one another. So, for example, giving them completely different material that has the same pitches like at the beginning, or giving them very similar material but exchanging it between them, as we have in the third part. And so, yeah, it's to do with those relationships, and they are, of course, sonic relationships as well as relationships between instruments.
Well, that takes a lot of knowledge of the instruments, and you write for many different instrumentations. How did you... I've always been curious how a composer has this knowledge, because I took piano for a few years when I was younger, but I still don't understand everything the piano can do, and much less know where to go with an idea that I want to make happen that I haven't actually ever done myself on an instrument I haven't played. So I'm just curious, how do you know if you know enough about the instrument to write for it?
Yeah, well, you don't.
You just do it, and you
don't
learn along
you don't
the way?
know, but I think we part of composing for instruments that one doesn't play oneself is a question of having an image in the mind of what this instrument is and what it does, and that has to do with listening to music. It has to do with studying scores to some extent. I mean, I learned the violin for 2 years when I was 11 and 12 as well. So I mean, that didn't get me very far. But at least there is a sense of how the instrument feels to be under the hands. And
do you go back to it when you're writing and you
Well, I don't actually have a violin, but I do have a fingerboard which I made myself. And I have one for each of the string instruments, and it has the positions and the harmonics and all of this kind of stuff marked on it, so I can work out whether a given fingering is actually going to happen or not.
Yeah. I see.
But I can also go beyond that sometimes, because I realize, that my imagination as a violinist, as an imaginary violinist, if you like, is nowhere near the extent to which somebody who's studied and played the repertoire like yourself would have. So I'm willing to go outside my own imagination to a certain extent, and to be speculative about it as well, because I think in everything that I write, I'm prepared for there to be things which require a certain amount of adjustment before they reach their final form, because I'm not interested in um, in a way of thinking which stays within previously accepted limits.
Why is that?
I think it keeps life interesting somehow. If you're constantly trying to do something that you haven't done before and you don't even know whether it can be done or not, it's like if I look back on my various musical activities over the past, whatever it is now, several decades, let's say, what I see is, I don't know if anybody else would see this, but what I see is a kind of concentric development whereby I'm not moving from one thing to another, but I'm constantly trying to encompass everything that I knew before and to add to it, and to push that envelope somehow. And I don't want to make any great claims for how that works its way out in a 3-minute piece for violin and piano, of course, because that's there's only so much you can do in that time, of course. But I think in general, I think that if for me making music is a process of discovery, then maybe that sense of discovery is something that is projected, that's expressed through the music, and which listeners can then appreciate for themselves. And it doesn't have to be something which completely changes the world of music every time they hear it, because that's a rather unrealistic expectation to have. But just the idea that every musical act, I don't know if you find this as a player, but I think as a composer, I do find this every music making act that I carry out, I feel should leave me knowing a little bit more than I did before, even while being aware of all the things I don't know, and all the things I can't do, and all the things that maybe I'll never be able to do. But yeah, there's a huge territory which one is in the process of discovering, maybe a small part of in a small project, or something larger in a larger project. And what is this world? I think it's to do with discovering something about how our imaginations work. And there's something very fundamental to do with consciousness, and maybe even to do with fundamental aspects of reality, if I can be so portentous, about the way that music affects us, and the nature of it. Where does it come from? Why do we do it at all, in fact? And all those questions which, as soon as you start asking them explicitly, you're led into some very unknown realms.
Mm-hmm. Right? Do you teach?
I do. I don't do very much, but I do a certain amount, because I've found over the years that the more I do, the less I feel that what I do makes what shall we say, the less effective I feel at what I am doing. Because if it goes on, if it takes up too much time and energy, then I begin to feel as if that time and energy is being taken away from what I should be doing, because you only have one chance to make a life for yourself, to make a musical life for yourself. But on the other hand, if it's too little, I feel that there's a certain kind of stimulation that is lost. And also, I think it's important to give something back, of course. That the fact that obviously the encounter with music at a certain point made a very profound change to the way I looked at everything, and to what I decided to devote myself to. Then I think it's a good idea to try and express that in a way that could really communicate itself to somebody else, that like the life-changing, the life-enhancing aspect of it.
I was curious because you mentioned how you think about the music that you're writing, and everyone thinks about music differently. So some people, when teaching composition, might take one aspect that they experience themselves and pass that on, and other people may take another aspect. And also another part of that is that you write a lot of information into your scores, and everyone writes differently. Like, they write different kinds of information into the music, and that's kind of a personal choice, but it's also a tactical choice. So I was just curious what elements of those things you feel that you can teach, and how much you're trying to just be true to yourself in each thing that you write. I guess that's just it's like a huge question, but it's a lot of related factors, I guess.
Well, going back to the question of teaching to start
with, who are you, and who is an individual student, and where does that line begin and end?
Well, I don't want to try and impose my musical personality on anybody else, or my musical techniques, or anything like that.
But it's a very good one, and a very good set of musical techniques.
Well, maybe, but I think it's important that everybody finds their own way. So what I find myself doing quite often when I'm teaching is that I say, well, this is how I might solve this issue that you're working with here, and if I'm doing well, I can say, and this is another possible way to deal with this issue. But then you have to go away and find your own. So I think by looking at different possibilities for the problem-solving aspects of composition, then you can point in the direction of the solution which belongs to the person that you're talking to. Rather than imposing yourself on it. And I think if you look at the people who've studied composition with me, very few of them have ended up doing anything like what I do, in fact. And one reason for that, I suppose, is that a lot of the teaching that I do is at an Institute for Electronic Music. And a lot of the students I'm working with are not writing music on paper at all. So that's also an interesting discipline for me to work with, because it means I have to find ways of talking about all the things I've been talking about in this interview so far in ways that don't require having a score in front of us. And I think
that's a challenge. It's different.
I think it should be possible to talk intelligently and even profoundly about music without always having to refer to notation. Obviously, it's very helpful to be able to do so, but I don't want to be in the position of becoming tongue-tied if there's no score. For example, if a piece of music has been improvised, or if it's been constructed on the computer without musical notation entering into it anywhere. There's no reason to think that either of those possibilities are any less complex and sophisticated than what you can do with notation.
Final question, other final question. What do you like most about being a composer or working in music?
Well, that's a hard question to answer in a few words, but I think that one of the things that I value most about it is the fact that there are areas of life, like composing music, for instance, and performing it for that matter as well, where a kind of imaginative freedom is allowed to us, which is not allowed in very many walks of life. And I think that then gives us a responsibility to demonstrate that, to use it in ways which will express it to people who maybe don't feel that they have that same degree of imaginative freedom, because we all have it, in fact. But a lot of people's lives don't emphasize that part of it, and I think so. So for me, being able to to make these discoveries I was talking about, and to be able to express them, if I can, to be able to communicate them if that's what's going on. I think that's for me the most valuable thing about what I'm doing.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. Bye.